That morning, London seemed too quiet, as if the city knew someone was about to unearth the kind of truth that kills. Hello, my friends. If you are a mystery enthusiast, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. The rain fell over London like a thick curtain of memories, while the old black Bentley glided through the streets of Mayfair, reflecting the city's ghostly headlights on the wet cobblestones. Inside the car, with an unlit cigarette between his fingers and a gaze that was lost beyond the glass, was the private detective Arthur Layton, a man in his early 40s, his expression marked by sleepless nights and a disheveled elegance that mixed charm and weariness. He had not been back to Gladwyck Mansion since the scandal that ended his career at Scotland Yard a decade ago, an affair buried between dead lovers, burned documents, and a promise that should never have been made. Now, he was just an unexpected guest at a reconciliation dinner hosted by the widow of his past. The mansion door creaked open with a mournful squeak, revealing Eleanor Gladwyck, paler than Arthur remembered her. She wore a crimson velvet dress that looked as if it had come from a trunk locked since the last war, and her eyes, though steady, hid layers of loneliness that had accumulated over the years. "Arthur, you came," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Someone had to come," he replied, taking off his hat and entering, as if crossing a minefield. The house, immense and stuffy, seemed to hold moisture in the corners of the soul, and the old portraits on the walls seemed to watch them with silent judgment. During dinner, surrounded by half a dozen heirs, lawyers, and a ghost-like butler, Arthur realized that the food was just a cover for an announcement. Eleanor intended to sell the estate and end the family's cycle of losses once and for all. But before that, she wanted to shed some light on the mysterious death of her sister, Lavinia Gladwyck, which had occurred 23 years earlier and had never been solved. The police shelved the case. They said it was an overdose, but Lavinia would never have gotten involved with morphine. "You knew her, Arthur." He nodded slowly, but inside something was stirring. He hadn't just known Lavinia, he'd loved her, and that was why he'd given up everything. After dinner, in a room drowning in tapestries and silence, Eleanor handed him a locked, wooden box embossed with the Gladwyck crest. "Lavinia used to hide letters here. Diaries too. We only got around to opening them this week." Arthur examined it, feeling the embossing beneath his fingers like a familiar scar. When he unlocked it with an old pin, a habit he had never lost, he found dozens of letters scribbled urgently, some torn at the edges. The first began with a disturbing sentence: "If anything happens to me, don't trust Jonathan." Jonathan Gladwyck was the youngest brother in the family and one of those present at dinner tonight. Arthur went up to his room, still absorbed by the shaky handwriting of the letter. The hallway on the second floor, lit by dim lamps, seemed to breathe along with the house, as if his every step awakened the echoes of the past. When he closed the door, he could not help but open the second letter. "They know. They are always close by, even when no one sees them. The house shelters them." The contents had a delirious tone, but Arthur knew Lavinia well enough to know that she was lucid, even if tormented, and that choice of words, "the house shelters them," echoed like a whisper coming from the walls. Arthur woke before dawn, with the strange sensation that someone had been watching him during the night. The old pocket watch he had inherited from his father showed 4:47, and its ticking sounded loudly in the saturated silence. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he lit a cigarette and remained still, staring at the oval mirror on the wall. In the reflection, he swore he saw a shadow cross the hallway behind the half-open door, but when he suddenly opened it, he found only emptiness. The red carpet slightly rippled, as if someone had recently passed by. A smell of lavender mixed with mold permeated the air, an odor that Arthur associated with old letters and farewells that were never fulfilled. Walking down the stairs with Lavinia's documents under his arm, he crossed paths with Jonathan Gladwyck, still wearing the same suit from the night before, disheveled and pale, as if he had been at war with his own ghosts. It's strange that you should come back just now, Leighton. Don't you get tired of trying to dig up corpses? Arthur just stared at him and replied with the calm of someone who is used to looking lies in the eye. Sometimes it's the corpse itself that decides to knock on the door. Jonathan smiled, but his eyes carried the kind of tension that could not be bought or faked. There was something hidden there, something that boiled beneath the surface of his false confidence. In the reading room, Arthur examined more of the letters. One of them made a direct allusion to Lavinia's secret meetings with someone called the P, and suggested that she had been forced to keep quiet about something she had discovered in the family finances. A tangle of names, dates, and cryptic symbols appeared at the bottom of the letter, as if she had begun to piece together a puzzle that would never be finished. The presence of such an OP intrigued Arthur. Eleanor, when questioned, hesitated before answering. Oscar Penrose, my father's former business partner. He disappeared months after Lavinia's death. The police considered him a fugitive, but they never found him. The name hung in the air like a ghost, waiting to be summoned again. Determined to follow a more solid trail, Arthur explored the library. He rummaged through the accounting books and discovered a hardcover notebook hidden behind a copy of Wuthering Heights. In it, financial notes intersected with the names of shell companies, large sums of money being moved, and references to Lavinia's name next to a Velvet Code 13. Something that made no sense at first, but seemed like the kind of disguised clue that only someone desperate to be heard would leave behind. The detective carefully removed the notebook and noticed, taped to the back cover, a newspaper clipping dated 1952. Fire consumes warehouse at port. One body is found, unidentified. Later, as he walked out of the greenhouse at the back of the mansion, Arthur was surprised to see Alice, the governess's young granddaughter, talking to herself among the plants. She was perhaps 18, with big eyes and a restlessness that was hard to hide. When she noticed Arthur, she fell silent and smiled as if asking for a secret. I talk to Lavinia sometimes, when the piano plays by itself in the hall. The sentence chilled Arthur, who bent down to look her in the eyes. And what does she tell you, Alice? The girl blinked slowly. She says she's still here, but trapped, like a memory that no one wants to open. Arthur stood up, feeling a presence sneaking behind the greenhouse curtain. When he looked, there was nothing, but the air was colder, and the piano at the back of the house emitted a single loose note. The next morning, Arthur went to central London to look through public records. He visited Oscar Penrose's old office, now boarded up and covered in faded rent signs. Talking to the building's doorman, he got a piece of information. Penrose would meet with Jonathan Gladwick at unusual times, usually after work, when the building was empty. One detail stood out. In the months leading up to Penrose's disappearance, he had been paranoid, convinced that he was being followed. He talked to himself, looked over his shoulder all the time, the doorman said. Arthur wrote down every detail, his intuition telling him that Lavinia and Penrose were on the verge of uncovering something that would explain their disappearance. Back at the mansion, Arthur went straight to Jonathan. The conversation, if it could be called that, was full of irony and latent tension. Do you know what intrigues me? Said Arthur, walking slowly through the living room where the other was drinking whiskey at 11 in the morning. Lavinia writes about fear, threats, mentions your name, and Penrose, your business partner, disappears without a trace. It seems that everyone who gets close to you disappears. Jonathan laughed, but with a tense jaw. Or maybe weak people kill themselves, and ghosts prefer to blame me. If you want to dig, Leighton, dig deep, but be careful what you find. Arthur approached, letting the silence weigh. That's what I'm doing, and I've already found enough mud to bury one more. That same afternoon, Eleanor summoned him to the third-floor gallery, a nearly abandoned room filled with old portraits and bedclothes-covered furniture. I found this yesterday, behind Lavinia's mirror. It was a letter that had never been sent, addressed to someone named A.L. Its contents confirmed the romantic involvement between Lavinia and Arthur, but it revealed something else. She intended to flee England with Penrose, taking documents that would prove that the family was laundering money. If I disappear, know that I tried to free myself. But there are more people involved than I realize, Arthur. Even Eleanor fears something. Arthur looked at the woman in front of him. Her eyes were no longer cold, as they had been the first day. They carried the weight of someone who was perhaps not only a widow of secrets, but a silent accomplice to them. That night, Arthur rummaged through Lavinia's old bedroom, now preserved as a mausoleum. In the back of the closet, behind a loose floorboard, he found an old leather briefcase. Inside were bank receipts in the name of fictitious companies, all associated with the Gladwick and Penrose group. But what disturbed him most was a photograph. Lavinia sitting on a garden bench looking serious, and in the background, half hidden by a curtain from the mansion, a figure peering out of the second-floor window. A man, a scruffy beard, an indistinct face, but Arthur was sure it wasn't Jonathan, and it wasn't Penrose. The face seemed familiar, like an echo of something buried. Behind the photo was a single penciled sentence: "He watches over us, always." Filled with urgency, Arthur crossed the darkened corridors to the west wing of the house, abandoned since the 1940s. As he tried to force open a locked door, he heard quick footsteps behind him. He turned around in a rush, but there was no one there. The doorknob turned of its own accord, or so it seemed, and the leaf creaked as it opened. The room was dusty, full of covered furniture and the smell of old paper. On the floor was a circular mark from a piece of furniture that had recently been removed. In the corner was a small, covered piano. As Arthur approached, one of the keys sank of its own accord, emitting a low note. A chill ran down his spine, and then, amid the echoes of that solitary note, he heard a voice behind him, a female voice, whispering, "You shouldn't have come back." Arthur spun around, but there was no one behind him. The voice still reverberated in his mind, as if it had come not from a living throat, but from inside the house itself. He took a deep breath, fighting the dizziness, and leaned against the piano. On impulse, he lifted the lid of the instrument. Inside, between the strings, was hidden a small copper key. Hanging from it was a medallion with the inscription CV13, the same code written in Lavinia's notebook. Arthur realized that this was not just a metaphor. It was a place, a safe, a compartment, and he had to find it before anyone noticed he was one step ahead. The next morning, Arthur left without warning and went to the underground archives of an old downtown bank he knew from his days as a police chief. Under a false name and some pressure, he gained access to Vault 13 of the Crimson and Vellum branch, a banking firm so discreet that it seemed as if it didn't want to be found. Inside the vault was a single metal box. Inside were official documents signed by members of Parliament, important figures involved in illicit dealings with Gladwick Industries, including an arms export contract altered by Penrose. Arthur felt his adrenaline rush. This wasn't just a family crime. It was a conspiracy. And Lavinia was in the center, alone, surrounded by enemies with surnames too influential to allow her to continue breathing. As he left the bank, Arthur noticed he was being followed. A tall man in a fedora and a dark overcoat was watching him from across the street. Feigning ignorance, the detective followed a side alley and disappeared into the alleys, returning through a secondary entrance to the hotel where he would be staying for safety. There, he took the opportunity to calmly examine the documents and found a signature that left him speechless for a moment. Eleanor Gladwick. A contract for the sale of land on the coast bore her approval alongside Penrose and Jonathan, and the final clause contained a handwritten addendum, "Burned after use, L." He did not know whether Lavinia was an accomplice or a victim at this point, but he was beginning to suspect that Eleanor was much more than a grieving widow. That night, Eleanor knocked on his bedroom door. There was No makeup on her face, and her eyes showed genuine weariness. She sat down in the chair opposite Arthur and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You are getting closer to the truth, and that never ends well. Do you think Lavinia was innocent? She played both sides. She loved you, yes, but she would not hesitate to give up her own sister if she thought she would be saved." Arthur stared at her intently, but did not answer. "I envied her," she continued, "not for her beauty, but for believing she could escape. I accepted my imprisonment from the day I was born into this family." When Eleanor stood, she touched Arthur's shoulder with a gentleness that hurt more than aggression. "Be careful. The past has teeth." Hours later, still awake, Arthur reviewed for the 1,000th time the photograph found in Lavinia's closet. This time, under the sidelight of the lamp, he noticed something that had escaped him. In the lower corner, almost erased by time, there was a signature. PR 52. Rummaging through the files, he remembered a forgotten name among the papers. Peter Rawley, the original butler of the Gladwyck mansion. He had disappeared the same year as Lavinia's death. Officially, he had retired. But now the question was inevitable. If Lavinia, Penrose, and Rawley had disappeared in the same year, what united them? And why did Lavinia's last letter say, "Don't trust Jonathan," when perhaps the enemy was hiding in his sister's shadow? Arthur left at dawn, before anyone in the mansion noticed. His destination was the St. Gertrude Orphanage on the outskirts of Richmond, where, according to a note scribbled at the bottom of one of the old papers, Peter Rawley had last been seen after leaving the Gladwyck family. There, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hensley greeted him suspiciously, but relented after he mentioned that he was investigating Lavinia's death. "Peter came here in 1953, said he had to hide something, and someone," she murmured. Arthur's heart raced. "Did he bring a child?" Mrs. Hensley nodded. "A girl. Her name was Grace, and he left an envelope with instructions in case anything happened to her. I never opened it. I waited for someone to come." The woman handed him a yellowed envelope with the initials LG in small letters in the corner. Inside the envelope was a letter, not from Rawley, but from Lavinia. Its contents were straightforward. She feared murder, and knew she would not have time to trust anyone in the family except Rawley. The child, Grace, was Lavinia and Penrose's daughter, and the girl's presence put everyone involved at risk. "They killed Oscar, and they're going to silence me too. Grace must disappear." Arthur sat stunned. An illegitimate child, an impossible inheritance. It all made sense now. The motivation behind Eleanor's silence, Penrose's sudden disappearance, the smear campaign against Lavinia in the newspapers of the day. It was a plot of blood, power, and reputation. Grace was the key, and if she were alive, she was probably the only one who could prove it all. Arthur left the orphanage with his mind on fire. The name Grace echoed like a belated warning. He called Eleanor from a payphone and arranged to meet her that evening in the mansion's inner garden, out of earshot of the household. When she showed up, she was covered by a dark shawl, her eyes bloodshot. He wasted no time. "Did you know about the child?" Eleanor hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I found out months later. Rawley told me, but he begged me to keep it a secret. I didn't know what to do. If it got out, the whole family would fall apart. Father was already sick. Jonathan threatened to destroy them all." Arthur stepped closer. "Did you give Lavinia away?" She didn't answer, but the single tear on her cheek said more than 1,000 words. Before leaving, Arthur walked to the mansion's old garden shed, a place Lavinia used to use as a refuge, according to Eleanor. He found the door half open, the interior filled with dry leaves and dust. On the floor, among abandoned tools, he saw an old biscuit tin. Inside it were more papers, this time partially burned. He managed to recover 2 names, M. Coleridge and PR Contract 28-7. With that, Arthur rushed to the former law firm that had represented the Gladwicks. There he found a document filed under seal. Peter Rawley had been appointed account manager in the name of Grace Penrose, which meant that she officially existed. But was she alive? And where? On his way back to the mansion, Jonathan intercepted him in the hallway. His brother's gaze was sharp. "You've dug too deep, Leighton. Don't you realize you're dealing with people who have never played fair?" Arthur, in a firm voice, replied, "Then it's time someone got their hands dirty for the truth." Jonathan smirked, and then, as if in a rehearsed gesture, he pushed Arthur against the wall and whispered, "You have no idea how many people have bled to keep this house standing." The detective pushed him back and left, but he knew his time was running out. The last piece of the puzzle was alive, and Jonathan now knew it too. Arthur spent the night mentally sorting through everything he knew. Grace Penrose existed, dead or alive. She was heir to a secret and perhaps a fortune. Jonathan had shown his claws, and Eleanor had finally let her mask slip. But the thread that connected everything still seemed hidden. In the morning, Arthur looked up the list of former employees of Gladwick Industries, and there it was. Mary Coleridge, Oscar Penrose's former personal secretary. Last known address, a convent on the outskirts of Bath. Arthur drove, without wasting time. When he arrived, he found a woman with white hair and guilt-filled eyes. "I knew Lavinia would die," she said without even waiting for questions. Oscar loved her, but she trusted her brother too much, and her own father. Everyone was afraid of scandal. Mary handed him an envelope that had been kept for more than 2 decades, which Lavinia had entrusted to her before she ran off with Rawley. Inside was a recent photograph, a young woman with eyes identical to Lavinia's and the angular features of Penrose. On the back was simply the name Grace and a date, April 1970. Arthur guessed that she would now be 23. One detail caught his eye. The young woman was wearing a necklace with the same coat of arms engraved on the wooden box Eleanor had given her at the beginning. "She lives in Brighton," Mary said, almost in a whisper. "She works in a little bookshop by the sea, but she doesn't know anything. Rawley never told her. He raised her as his niece. Lavinia wanted to spare her everything." Arthur thanked her, his mind made up. The next stop would be Brighton. The bookstore was modest, with a faded sign and old wooden shelves. Arthur walked in, and there she was, Grace. Her brown hair was pulled back in a careless bun, and her eyes held a depth that could not be learned with time. She looked at him, curiously. "Can I help you?" He hesitated. "I need to talk to you. It's about your mother." She frowned. "My mother died when I was little." Arthur nodded slowly. "Not exactly." He invited her to a cafe on the beachfront, where he told her the truth. No frills, no mercy. Grace listened to everything with the calm of someone who senses that her life is a lie. "If all this is true, why now?" Arthur replied, "Because there are still people willing to kill, so that you never know." When they returned to the bookstore, they found the window broken. Books were thrown on the floor, papers were torn, and on the wall, written in black ink, a threat: "Go back to her grave." Arthur took Grace by the hand, and they left through a side door. Someone knew he had found her. That night, he stayed with her in a discreet hotel, where for the first time in a long time, he let his defenses down. "You are just like her," he said, "in the way you look, in the way you distrust the world, and still love." Grace stared at him in silence. "She loved you too, didn't she?" Arthur just nodded. "But she failed me." Before going to sleep, he left the folder with the documents under the pillow and slept with a gun in his hand. The past had come back to the surface, and someone was coming to drown them. When dawn broke, Grace was not in the room. The bed was empty, the window was ajar, but there was no sign of a struggle. Only an envelope on the table with a firm handwriting. "I need to find out for myself. I'll be back before the end." Arthur felt his stomach turn. He called Eleanor, who answered with a choked voice. Jonathan is out of control. I tried to stop him, but he knows about Grace. And now he's going to finish what he started with Lavinia." Arthur hung up without another word and hurried to his car. The road from Brighton to London seemed narrower and quieter than ever. And deep down he knew, if Grace fell into the wrong hands, all the past would die with her, and Lavinia would be buried for the second time. Arthur arrived at Gladwick Manor late in the afternoon, just as the London sky was beginning to weigh down with dark clouds. The silence inside the house was as thick as the dust that covered the furniture. Eleanor was waiting for him in the old tea room, now transformed into a dark refuge. "Does Jonathan know where she is?" Arthur asked bluntly. Eleanor answered with a blank look. "He has eyes everywhere, always has. The new butler is an ex-cop. The gardener is the cousin of an old business partner of his. And some people think this is all about inheritance, but it's about control." Arthur interrupted her. "Grace disappeared this morning. You have to help me find her before he does." Eleanor hesitated, then pulled a crumpled letter from her pocket. "She was here yesterday, in disguise. She spoke to me for a few minutes and left me this." It was a letter written by Grace, addressed to Lavinia herself. "I forgive you, even though I don't know you. But I will not live surrounded by the fear you tried to spare me." The letter ended with an address, the now abandoned Penrose seaside estate in Dover. Arthur set off at once, speeding along the wet roads. When he reached the house, the large house was boarded up with old boards, but one of the boards had been removed. He entered cautiously. The interior exuded abandonment, but there was a sense of presence in the air, as if time had stood still, waiting for something to be done. On the second floor, she found clear signs that someone had been there. Fresh footprints in the dust, food remains in a bag, and on the desk a diary with the name Grace Rawley on the cover. She wrote like someone trying to piece together an identity puzzle. Pages filled with questions. Why did they lie to me? What did Lavinia want me to see here? Who was Peter, really? But what caught her attention most was the final page. "I found the contracts. They were in the compartment in the false bookcase. There's a copy. For the press, if anything happens, they'll know." Just as she finished reading, she heard a crack downstairs, muffled voices. One of them, unmistakable, Jonathan. Arthur turned off the lamp and crept to the stairs. Jonathan was with two armed men, ruthlessly searching the place. "She's here." The young lady decided to play the heroine, but that's okay. The game's over. Arthur backed away, trying to imagine where Grace could have hidden. It was then that he remembered the basement. He climbed down the outside of the house and found the half-open hatch. Inside, among broken wine racks and damp boxes, he found Grace, trembling, with a folder of documents on her lap. "They're here," she whispered. Arthur pulled her by the hand. "Let's go out along the beach, along the fisherman's trail, now." As they fled, the house erupted in shouts and orders. A shot rang out and a bullet hit a nearby tree. But Arthur knew the terrain. Within minutes, they reached a fishing village where an old friend, old Jack, a former cop like himself, had hidden them in a shed. There, Arthur looked at Grace, dirty and scared, but firm. "You have something in your hands that could change everything." She handed him the folder. It has names, dates, even letters between Jonathan and government officials. They sold weapons to enemy countries in the war. Lavinia was going to expose everything. That's why she died. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. "Now, they're going to try to kill you too." With the documents in hand, Arthur knew the time was up. They couldn't run forever, and Grace was no longer just an heir from the past. She was now a political target. The papers contained names too powerful to ignore, and an international scandal could ensue if it all came to light. Arthur decided they would return to London, but not to hide, to expose. He contacted a veteran journalist, Edward Balcom, a former alcoholic hungry for one last headline before retirement. "If what you're saying is true, Leighton, it will rock Parliament. But do you have any proof that Jonathan was directly involved? Arthur looked at the folder and replied, "I have his signature, I have letters of confession, I have the motive, and now I have the daughter of the woman he killed." Grace remained in a secure hotel while Arthur and Balcom prepared the publication. But Jonathan was not about to wait. That same night, he broke into Arthur's room with two men and held him down with a revolver pressed against his ribs. "You are stubborn, Leighton. This will kill you." Arthur remained calm. "How did you kill Lavinia? How did you make Penrose disappear? And Rawley?" Jonathan pushed him against the wall, growling, "I protected this family. I protected the Gladwick name. Do you think Lavinia was a saint? She would sink everyone for a romantic whim. I can't let Grace do that again." Arthur glared at him. "You are afraid of a free young woman." Jonathan did not answer. He left the room with only one sentence. "If Grace gives up the papers, there will be no tomorrow for her." Arthur met Eleanor for the last time. They were in his house in a dark room where time seemed to congeal. "He's ready to kill again," Arthur said. Eleanor, exhausted, dropped her wineglass and covered her face with her hands. "I tried to stop him, Arthur, but I was weak. I was afraid of him, of what he knew about me, about Father, about all of us." Arthur stepped closer. "You can still stop this." She pulled an envelope from inside her blouse. "It's a copy of Lavinia's original will, handwritten with Grace's name on it. I've kept it all this time, in fear and shame." Arthur held the paper as if it were the memory of Lavinia herself. "You did what you could. Now it's my turn." That night, Arthur armed himself. He met Grace at the hotel and explained everything. "This will be on the front page of every newspaper tomorrow morning. But Jonathan won't wait. He'll come first. And I want you far away." She didn't accept. "If my mother died trying to protect me, I'm not going to run away now. It's time to finish what she started." Arthur hesitated but didn't insist. He knew she was Lavinia's daughter, stubborn, brave, impulsive, and perhaps that would save him more than any weapon. They prepared for the confrontation as if they were about to go to war. But deep down, it was just a reunion with the truth, and with the man who had dedicated his life to burying it. Jonathan showed up at 3:47 a.m. He walked into the hotel lobby with an armed partner. Arthur was waiting for him, gun in hand, hiding behind the counter. As Jonathan stepped forward, a shot rang out. The man with him fell. Jonathan stood still. "You never knew how to back down, Leighton." Arthur stepped out of the shadows. "And you never knew when you lost." Grace appeared behind him, holding the documents. "It's too late, Jonathan. Everyone knows it by now." For a moment, the Gladwick heir just took a deep breath. Then he smiled. Sad, defeated, perhaps relieved. "Then it's over." Arthur didn't shoot. He just watched as Jonathan dropped the gun and walked toward the door. When the police arrived minutes later, he had already turned himself in. For the first time, someone in the Gladwick family had chosen to face shame. The scandal was already spreading through the newspapers like wildfire. Politicians were falling, companies were collapsing, and the Gladwick name was whispered in the corridors of power like a family curse. But none of this brought Arthur peace. He watched Grace from afar, walking through the London docks in the same grey coat that Lavinia had worn years ago, a detail he had only just noticed. She looked so much like her. Jack, his former police colleague, murmured beside him. Arthur just nodded. But it's not Lavinia, it's another story, another burden. And yet the same danger loomed. Jonathan had been missing since his release on bail. And Grace still carried the original documents in a hidden folder. That night, Arthur returned to the apartment. A note was waiting on the table. "The last piece is in the marble hall. Go alone." He knew it at once. It was Jonathan. This was no ordinary trap. It was an end foretold. He left without telling Grace. When he reached the marble hall of the old Gladwick Industries headquarters, the place was in shadow. But there was a single light burning above the old stained glass window where the family crest still flickered. Jonathan was there, leaning against the wall, thinner, his face ravaged. "You win, Leighton," he said with a half-smile. "But tell me, was it worth destroying an entire legacy for a girl who didn't even know who she was until 2 weeks ago?" Arthur approached slowly. "She knows now, and she knows enough not to repeat your cycle." Jonathan pulled a gun from his pocket, but he didn't point it. He just held it, as if weighing honor and despair. "My father killed Oscar. My sister tried to stop him. I just obeyed. I was Gladwick's faithful dog, and look where that got me." He handed the gun to Arthur without resistance. "End it. Do it your way." But Arthur didn't shoot. He just called the police, who came to get him minutes later. As he left, Jonathan took one last look at the stained glass window. At least someone survived. The next morning, Arthur went to Grace. She was waiting for him on the sidewalk outside the bookstore, an envelope in her hands. "This is what's left of Lavinia. The letters, the photographs, some I've never read myself. I don't know if I want to know everything." Arthur put his hand over hers. "Knowing is a burden, but it's also freedom." She didn't cry. She just nodded and hugged him tightly. "Are you going?" He thought for a moment. "I don't think so. There are still things that need to be read, and stories that can't be forgotten." Grace smiled. A small, fragile, real smile. "Then read it with me." That night, they sat on the floor of the bookstore, surrounded by old books and recent ghosts. Arthur quietly read Lavinia's last letter. "If my daughter ever reads this, I want her to know the love that destroyed me was also the one that saved me, because in it, I was true, even if only for a short time." Grace cried silently. Arthur just held her hand. The city outside didn't care about another closed case, but inside that small bookstore, between the past that finally found a name and the future still uncertain, 2 souls departed from the darkness too. Something that, if not peace, was at least understanding. Months passed. Jonathan was convicted. Eleanor sold the Gladwick mansion and moved to Italy, where she wrote a book under a pseudonym, The Women of the Voiceless House. It became a bestseller among readers curious about noble scandals. Jack, Arthur's old partner, returned to his small house in Dover, saying that this was his last real case. And Arthur, he stayed, not to be a hero, but because he discovered that there were things that can only be understood by staying. In the bookstore, now renamed Veludo and Mar, Arthur and Grace were organizing an exhibition with real historical documents. Schools were starting to visit. Researchers came from far away. A journalist asked if Arthur was the man who had unraveled the Gladwicks. He answered simply, "I was just the only one who didn't accept the easy versions." Grace smiled in the background. She was writing now, memoirs, fragments, fictions with real roots. Lavinia was on every page, but she was also overcome. One morning, Grace found Arthur asleep in the chair in front of her, Lavinia's book on his lap. "Do you still love her?" she asked, more to herself than to him. Arthur opened his eyes, calm. "I love what she left me, but it's you I'm staying with." There were no kisses, no promises, just a touch of fingers, a shared breath, and the silent understanding that sometimes survival is the most radical act of love. In the last envelope, kept in an old Gladwick, "Industry's safe," they found a note in Peter Rawley's shaky handwriting. "To the next generation, we leave not the burden of truth, but the chance not to repeat it." The phrase became a sign at the entrance to the bookstore. And when the rain fell again on London, with its dark rooftops and streets soaked in the past, Grace would turn on the light in the window, put on a jazz record and say, "Today, the city seems less hostile." And it was true. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.